The officer's command cut through the tense air, "Get him." A powerful German shepherd, trained for one purpose, lunged forward. Its target, a frail, elderly man who could barely stand. A crowd watched in fear, expecting the worst. But what happened in a split second before impact wasn't in any training manual. It was an act that would leave everyone on the scene in stunned silence, and prove that some bonds can never be broken by time, trauma, or even a direct command. The sun-drenched afternoon air, once filled with the light, carefree laughter of children and the gentle, rhythmic creak of swing sets, grew heavy and still. It was a silence born of fear, spreading outwards from the two patrol cars whose flashing lights bled silent, pulsing strokes of red and blue onto the vibrant green of the park. At the epicenter of this sudden vortex of tension sat an old man, a figure seemingly carved from forgotten time. He was less a person and more a ghost haunting the edges of a cheerful world, his frame frail, his gaze lost in the labyrinth of his own mind. He clutched a weathered duffel bag to his chest not merely as luggage, but as if it contained the last fragile fragments of his identity. The officer's approach was a study in practiced caution. To them, he was not a man, but a variable in an equation of public safety. Their questions, initially calm, sharpened with each unanswered second. When one commanded him to stand, the request seemed to wage a war against the old man's very bones. A tremor, originating deep within his soul, radiated through his limbs. He struggled to rise, a pained grimace twisting his face as he instinctively guarded his side, his body a testament to a lifetime of hardships. "I'm just resting," he managed to breathe out, the words a moth-eaten whisper, barely a ripple in the suffocating atmosphere. His vulnerability, however, was tragically misinterpreted as passive resistance. In the cold calculus of risk assessment, an unresponsive man with an unknown bag near a playground was a threat that had to be neutralized. The standoff escalated irrevocably with the arrival of the K-9 unit. The click of the SUV door opening was as loud as a gunshot in the silent park. Out stepped Shadow, a magnificent German shepherd who was not merely a dog, but a living weapon, a sculpture of conditioned muscle and unwavering obedience. His presence was an immediate declaration of force, a low, guttural vibration humming in his chest as his intelligent eyes, like polished obsidian, locked onto the target. His handler, a man whose stern features seemed etched from the same granite of authority, stood as the conduit for this power. He let the palpable fear of the crowd build, a silent tool of intimidation. His voice, when it finally came, was not a shout but a blade of sound, honed to perfection. "Last warning, sir. Comply now." The old man remained frozen, trapped not by defiance, but by a terror so profound it had stolen his voice and shackled his limbs. Seeing only the failure to obey, the officer gave the final, chilling command. The two words sliced through the silence, sharp and irrevocable: "Get him." In an explosion of controlled fury, Shadow launched himself forward, the ground thrumming beneath his powerful paws. A collective gasp was stolen from the onlookers' lungs as the sleek, dark form closed the distance in a terrifying blur, destined to collide with the fragile old man who could only watch, his eyes wide with the acceptance of his fate. The world seemed to lurch into slow motion. The dog, a dark projectile of disciplined fury, was a breath away from its target. But in the final, critical instant where teeth should have met flesh, the laws of physics and years of conditioning inexplicably buckled. In a breathtaking violation of its own forward momentum, the German shepherd dug its claws into the earth, tearing up clumps of grass as it skidded to a halt. The air, which had been vibrating with impending violence, was suddenly pierced by a sound so alien it stunned everyone present, not the savage bark of an attacked dog, but a high, confused whimper, a note of profound inner bewilderment. The creature's entire being transformed before their eyes. The rigid posture, honed for combat, softened into something less certain. The lethal growl that had rumbled in its chest dissolved as if it had never been, replaced by the soft panting of confusion. Its ears, once pinned back in a declaration of war, swiveled forward, straining to decipher a signal that had bypassed all logic and training. It was as if the dog was listening to a ghost. And then, the source of that spectral signal became known. From the old man's lips, a single word emerged, so faint it was more a feeling than a sound, an ephemeral whisper carried on a wave of pure desperation. Shadow. The name struck the animal with the force of a physical blow. It was as if a key, long thought lost, had just been slipped into a lock buried deep within its soul, turning a mechanism rusted shut by time and trauma. The dog recoiled slightly, its powerful body trembling not with aggression, but with the aftershocks of a seismic memory. A longer, more plaintive whine escaped its throat, a sound of heartbreak and dawning recognition. The officer, baffled by this unprecedented dereliction of duty, gave a sharp, angry tug on the leash. Heel. What's wrong with him? He demanded, but Shadow was an anchor, immovable, held fast by chains of loyalty that stretched back across years and continents. Seeing the flicker of a forgotten world in the animal's eyes, the old man, Frank, felt a surge of impossible hope break through the dam of his fear. He slowly, painstakingly, reached out a trembling hand. It was no longer the hand of a victim, but that of a supplicant, praying for a miracle. Tears, hot and cleansing, began to trace paths of clarity down his weathered face, washing away years of grime and despair. Shadow, he repeated, his voice stronger now, choked with the weight of 6 lost years. It's me. Son, it's me. It's Frank. For one final, agonizing moment, the dog's body remained taut as the soldier it was trained to be battled with the companion it once was. Then, with a shudder that ran the length of its spine, the past won. The war was over. Recognition, pure and absolute, flooded its intelligent eyes. He stepped forward, not with the confidence of an aggressor, but with the tentative caution of a lost soul approaching a sacred memory. His nose brushed against the worn fabric of Frank's coat, inhaling a scent that had been the singular smell of safety and home. The crowd watched, breathless, as the fierce K9, in a gesture of ultimate surrender and profound love, folded its powerful body, sat down, and gently, reverently, rested its massive head upon the old man's lap. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotion, broken only by the sound of Frank's ragged, weeping breaths as he buried his face in the thick fur of the friend he thought he had lost forever. The soldier had found his general, the dog, after years lost in a wilderness of commands, had finally come home. The park was now a silent, open-air cathedral, holding its breath around the fragile tableau at its center. The raw, guttural authority of law enforcement had evaporated, leaving behind a group of officers who stood not as enforcers, but as humbled witnesses. Their vests, their weapons, their years of training, all of it felt clumsy and inadequate in the face of this sacred, inexplicable reunion. They had been prepared for confrontation, for resistance, for the cold mechanics of arrest, but no training manual, no academy lecture, had ever outlined the protocol for encountering a miracle. They were adrift in uncharted emotional territory, their professional certainties shattered. It was one of the younger officers, his face pale with a mixture of shock and awe, who finally broke the spell. His voice, when he keyed his radio, was stripped of all its earlier, sharp-edged authority. It was quiet, almost reverent, a stark contrast to the commands that had echoed across the grass just moments before. He wasn't calling for backup, he was searching for a story, for the missing pages of a history that had just spectacularly announced its presence. He requested background checks, one for the John Doe who was no longer just a vagrant, and one, almost absurdly, for the decorated police K9 who had just committed the ultimate act of disobedience. The wait that followed was thick and heavy, an eternity compressed into minutes. Then, the radio crackled to life, a harsh, electronic sound that felt like a sacrilege in the hallowed quiet. A disembodied voice from dispatch began to speak, and with each word, the truth began to unspool, not as a report, but as a resurrection. The name came first, landing with the weight of a dropped stone in a still pond, Franklin, Frank Ward. Then his title, a sudden, staggering mantle of dignity that settled upon the frail man on the ground, retired military sergeant, decorated K9 handler. The dispatcher's voice grew softer, tinged with disbelief, as the narrative of Frank's ghost life unfolded. 6 years ago, in a theater of war thousands of miles away, Sergeant Ward's unit had been ambushed. An IED blast had turned their vehicle into a funeral pyre, an inferno that consumed everyone inside. He was officially listed as killed in action, a name etched onto the cold granite of a memorial wall, his chapter believed to be brutally and definitively closed. But Frank had not died. By some cruel twist of fate, he had been thrown clear, the blast's sole survivor. He had walked away from his own grave, but had left his mind behind in the firestorm. A severe traumatic brain injury had acted as a thief, stealing his memories, his identity, his very connection to the world. He became a ghost wandering his own country, a man without a past, falling through the cracks of the very system he had fought to defend. He was a hero that his nation had mourned, forgotten, and then discarded. A pause, and then the dispatcher's voice returned, weaving the second thread of the tragedy. The dog, K9 Shadow, had also been recovered from the wreckage of that same attack, a traumatized but physically unharmed survivor. In the cold, efficient triage of military assets, the dog was deemed fit for service. His past was intentionally scrubbed from his file, his connection to the fallen Sergeant Ward severed. He was reassigned, his grief and loyalty recalibrated through rigorous retraining for domestic law enforcement, his spirit reforged in the crucible of new commands. The two narratives, two streams of profound loss, converged in that moment into a single, devastating river of truth. They were not two separate entities, they were two broken halves of a single, heroic whole, set on parallel paths of quiet suffering, never meant to find each other again. A wave of understanding, so powerful it was almost a physical force, washed over the officers. Hands that had rested on holsters now rose to cover mouths. Holsters were snapped shut with a quiet click of finality. The rigid barrier between law and citizen crumbled into dust. In their eyes, the suspicious man was transfigured into a forgotten warrior, and the disobedient dog into a guardian angel who had never forgotten his charge. They had arrived to enforce an order, but they had stayed to witness a testament to a love that had navigated the labyrinth of death, amnesia, and time itself to finally, impossibly, come home. The reunion, captured on a dozen trembling smartphones, did not simply go viral, it became a global phenomenon. It was a digital flood, a torrent of shared humanity that swept across continents, its raw emotional power resonating in a world weary of division and cynicism. News headlines bloomed like desert flowers after a rare rain, the K9 who remembered. A soldier's lost loyalty found. It transcended the fleeting nature of internet fame to become a modern parable, a testament to something primal and pure. People saw not just a dog disobeying an order, but an act of love so profound it had navigated the labyrinth of trauma, the void of amnesia, and the unyielding march of time. In a world governed by rigid orders, Shadow had chosen loyalty, and an entire world wept with him in collective gratitude. Later that day, as the golden afternoon light began to fade, the system itself arrived. A phalanx of authority descended upon the park, supervisors in starched uniforms that seemed out of place on the soft grass, a city attorney whose leather briefcase contained the cold language of liability, and the department's K9 coordinator, a man who viewed dogs through the lens of performance metrics. They represented the unfeeling logic of rules, the impartial machinery of bureaucracy that was now tasked with dissecting a miracle. The question before them was a clinical one, but it held the power to shatter a newly mended world. What happens next? Technically, Shadow was a city asset, a highly trained tool who had failed at his primary function. He had disobeyed a lawful command in a critical situation, an infraction that would typically mandate his immediate removal from service. For Frank, seated on a borrowed blanket with Shadow's head resting faithfully in his lap, a new and more insidious terror took root. It was the cruelest of ironies, to be given back his entire world, only to face the possibility of having it torn away again by a line in a rulebook. It was the K9 officer, the man who had given the order, who became the first crack in the system's armor. He had stood by, a silent, shaken observer, but now he stepped forward. His gaze was fixed not on his superiors, but on the inseparable pair before him. "He's made his choice," the officer stated, his voice quiet but unbreakable. "And frankly, sir, so have we. The commander, a veteran whose face was etched with the weight of countless difficult decisions, understood. He did not stride, he approached, closing the distance between rank and humanity. Then, in an act of profound respect that silenced all protocol, he knelt down, surrendering the vertical advantage of his authority to meet Frank at eye level. He looked at the two of them, not as a problem to be solved, but as a story to be honored. Frank's eyes, filled with a lifetime of sorrow and a moment of impossible hope, met his. His entire resurrected world hung suspended in the fragile space between one heartbeat and the next as he whispered the question that contained everything. You're not taking him, are you? The commander placed a steadying hand on Frank's shoulder, his voice imbued with a compassion that no policy could ever script. No, Sergeant, he said, deliberately using the military rank that the world had forgotten, in a single word restoring a decade of stolen dignity. We're not taking him. We're bringing him home. A collective exhale swept through the remaining crowd, a wave of joyous relief so palpable it was almost physical. For once, the unbending iron of the system had not just bent, it had bowed. It had bowed before a love so fierce it had survived a war, so persistent it had outlasted memory, and so pure it had reminded everyone present of the best parts of themselves. Weeks later, in a quiet, sun-dappled veterans' community that smelled of mown grass and clean linen, their new life began. It was more than a home, it was a sanctuary. Frank had his first medical checkup in 6 years, his body finally receiving the care it had long been denied. Shadow was officially retired and given a new leather collar, his military name, his true name, engraved just beneath his retired police badge. They slept soundly for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, side by side on a soft rug before a small fireplace, their gentle snores a peaceful duet, just as they had done in desert bunkers under a sky of foreign stars. They did not just heal, they became healers. Their story permeated the community, inspiring other veterans, men who had walled off their own traumas, to begin speaking of their pasts. Frank and Shadow were living monuments to a love that refused to die. No one saw a broken old man and a dangerous dog anymore. They saw two survivors, two brothers in arms, two halves of a single soul made whole again. They had finally completed their last, most important mission. They had found their way home, not through orders or missions, but through a love that had simply, stubbornly, refused to forget. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a dog who disobeyed a command. It was a story about a love that refused to be forgotten, a loyalty that survived war, and a memory that lived in the heart, not just the mind. Frank and Shadow remind us that beneath the uniforms, the labels, and the years of hardship, some bonds are simply unbreakable. Sometimes, the most important orders aren't the ones we are given, but the ones our hearts refuse to let go of. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder of what loyalty truly means. And let us know in the comments what part of their reunion moved you the most. Thank you for watching.